Hi, this is Andrew, and this is Keen On, the daily now.tv chat show with some of the world's leading thinkers and writers. Hello, everybody. I am just back, for better or worse, from a glorious few days in the southwestern Sicilian town of Syracuse. A beautiful place for those of you who have been there, full of history. One of the great cities of the Mediterranean, a place where the Peloponnesian War was fought and where the remains of many aspects of antiquity are self-evident. As it happens, coincidentally or not, we're talking today with the author of a book, a novel about Syracuse, which is actually based on the events of the Peloponnesian War. It's called Glorious Exploits. It's a first novel by my guest, Ferdia Lennon. It's already been acclaimed. It's existing in a UK and a US version. It also has 6 foreign translations. So it's quite an achievement for a first book. And Ferdia Lennon is joining us from a writing retreat in the Irish countryside. So congratulations, Ferdia, on the book, Glorious.
Thanks very much, Andrew, for that lovely introduction. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, all right.
Great. Yeah, sorry, just so that's amazing. I didn't know that you'd just been on a visit to Syracuse. That's lovely to hear that.
I'm not sure if do you pronounce it Syracuse or Syracuse. Of course, there's a Syracuse in upstate New York, which is profoundly different in every sense from the Syracuse in Sicily.
Yeah, I think either are good. Syracuse.
So back to my question. Did you spend much, and was it a good excuse to do some research for the book? Did you spend much time in Syracuse?
Yeah, I mean, I would recommend that to all writers. Set your novel somewhere beautiful and do lots of research. So I did spend a bit of time in Sicily, and most of that time was spent in Syracuse. I wanted to have a sense, obviously, that my novel's set thousands of years ago, but still, you can visit the limestone quarries where the Athenian prisoners of war were kept. You can also see the ancient Greek amphitheater, and you can just get a sense, a little bit of the space as well, of the proximity of the sea, etc., which was just important for me to try to evoke that very distant past, grounded in genuine kind of research.
You're a scholar of antiquity. What interests you in not just the history of the ancients, but also specifically the Romans and the Greeks?
Yeah, I think I've always been fascinated by both ancient Rome and but more so ancient Greece. Part of it's the innovation of the period. So whether it's the foundation of democracy, tragedy, comedies, tragic drama, comedic drama, philosophical innovations. It's just this really incredible time where it seems like everything is up for grabs, everything is questioned. So from a very young age, I've been fascinated with that period, and I always do. I wanted to write something about it, but didn't quite know what that would be or what form it would take.
We've done some shows both with historians and novelists about innovation in antiquity. We also discussed perhaps the nostalgia we moderners, and it's not just 21st century moderners, but modern people in the last 500 years have felt towards antiquity, excuse me, Ferdia. Do you think that's sometimes an excuse for not addressing our own woes and problems, returning continually to the Greeks and Romans, particularly Greece?
Yeah, I don't know if it's to not address, but yeah, maybe that idealization that we have, back then things were actually happening, or things were, if not so much better. I do think there's in somewhat for good reason, because there were amazing achievements of that period, but there's also a huge amount of darkness and things that we would find far less palatable. And I think for me, that is that juxtaposition of the familiar and the quite alien. If you read, ancient Greek drama, comedy, Thucydides, a lot of it is oddly recognizable, but then you'll have, over 50% of the population often were enslaved. You had democracy, but women couldn't vote. You could only vote if you were like a male citizen. So yeah, it's that blend of the deeply relatable and then the very unfamiliar, which I find quite interesting.
Do you think we have much in common, Ferdia? Your book, we're going to get to the book in a few minutes, but was it a foreign world, profoundly foreign, so different that really for us, we might as well be looking at some sort of alien civilization?
I don't believe so. I think, like what I was kind of speaking to there, I think there are aspects of it that would have been very unsettling. You go to the market and a significant portion of the people around you doing their shopping would have been slaves. I think there would have been there were mercenaries, but essentially the military was largely made up of the citizen body. So that acknowledgement that you could just have to go and defend your homeland in a very violent fashion. Inevitably there'd be a lot more people just walking around deeply disfigured from war, etc. Yet, as I said, you had democracy. It was a different form of democracy. You had theater, public service, philosophical debates. So I think it would be that strange mixture that you have even when you read, literature in the period. Yeah.
One of our current preoccupations, again, you don't need me to tell you this, is the health of democracy in the US, also in the UK. We look back often to the ancients, but going around Sicily, particularly to Agrigenta, and seeing some of the temples and the worshipping to the gods, it doesn't seem to have been really, especially in a place like Syracuse, a great deal of democracy around. What was the politics of Syracuse? How did it work? Were these tyrannies?
Well, interestingly, one of the interesting things about Sicily is its most famous ruler is probably Dionysius of Sicily, who was essentially a complete, brutal tyrant. And you're never very far from a complete shift of government. So at the time that my novel is set, 412 BC, you have a direct democracy, based on the Athenian model. Now, of course, with the kind of exceptions that only adult male citizens could vote. However, before that, it would have been an oligarchy made up largely of the kind of wealthy aristocrats in the kind of period preceding my novel. And then afterwards, what you have is this kind of demagogue figure who at one level seems to be, a savior of the democracy, who then, as often happens, kind of clutches at power. And what you have then is something a lot more brutal and limited. You have a much more limited focus of power and a more brutal regime than anything that had come before. So it's Syracuse is everything, from democracy to, in the following decades, tyranny.
Some of the theorists of democracy who try to ape antiquity suggest that these were small communities, and when in Syracuse, I stayed in Ortigia, which is the historical center of old Syracuse. It's a very small place. How many people lived in Syracuse in around 412 where your novel is based?
It's hard to say for certain. Probably a few 100,000. So Ortiga was the old city center because it was easily kind of fortifiable, almost like an island. It was an island initially, and they built a causeway out to it. So yeah, that would have been and then it spread out. You had the Aquadina. So the amount of people that were living on that island or Ortigia would have been, relatively small, but in the kind of hinterland of the city-state of Syracuse, would have been a lot larger, probably over, maybe a couple of 100,000, maybe, of people who were technically citizens.
Let's then go to this year when your novel takes place, 412 BC. This was in the middle of the Peloponnesian War. Who was fighting the Peloponnesian War, and what was the significance of Syracuse?
Okay, so the Peloponnesian War was a war, in a simple terms, was between Athens and Sparta. And there was real fear in Greece in general that Athens's imperialistic ambitions were just going to keep building and building. And eventually this kind of spilled out into a war between Athens and its maritime kind of island allies. A lot of them didn't actually were members of the Delian League, and didn't actually necessarily want to be Athenian allies. They were forced into it. And then Sparta and its kind of Peloponnesian allies like Corinth, etc. And then Athens essentially goes over to Sicily to arbitrate between a conflict that Syracuse is involved in. So their official reason was that it was almost like a humanitarian intervention. But behind the scenes in Athens, there was very much an awareness or a discussion of, okay, if we can arbitrate, defeat Syracuse, we can then kind of move unimpeded around the island and possibly use the resources of Sicily, which was very, very wealthy, maybe to move over to Carthage, which was even wealthier. And there was a sense that they could kind of keep building and using these various resources and of troops and gold and trade routes. Then they would be able to finally win the war in Greece against Sparta. So yeah, it's that interesting example of a pattern that we often still see, where an intervention is presented as humanitarian and quite limited, but actually where the overall objectives are much larger scale and with a great deal more self-interest than is officially claimed.
Was the war presented in any way in cultural terms between different peoples of different languages, or was it presented in economic and just hard military terms about power?
It was a mixture, because you had the Ionian Greeks, Athens was Ionian, and then the Doric Greeks, the Spartans. But really, it was a mix. Sometimes you would have allies. Traditionally, those kind of peoples would fight together or have more of a tendency to have alliances. But during this war and other wars, it really mixed around. And also traditionally, for example, you would have the idea that Athens tended to support other democracies because it was a democracy itself. Sparta was an oligarchy, so it tended to be more conservative and favor other oligarchies. But that wasn't a hard and fast rule. Syracuse was a democracy like Athens, yet they were completely, vicious enemies. So, yeah, power and, self-interest and shifting alliances was the order of the day.
What's the big deal then, Ferdia, about the Peloponnesian War? The history of antiquity is the history of war, many different wars between many different peoples, city-states, empires. Why do we always seem to be returning to the Peloponnesian War, whether it's historians, theorists of international relations, or even novelists like yourself?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think part of it is just that Thucydides, who was an Athenian, wrote his famous History of the Peloponnesian War. And I think it's kind of like a masterpiece book. It's very, very detailed. It's the first example of its kind. We have Herodotus, who wrote his histories, but Herodotus was a lot more willing to kind of, sacrifice, let's say, truth and probability in service of a good story. Herodotus would take the most interesting story. So you'll often have gods or, quite magical occurrences in Herodotus's histories. Whereas on the other hand, Thucydides was much more of a skeptical realist. I wouldn't maybe you could say cynical, but I would say just very deeply skeptical, somewhat pessimistic about human nature. And it creates this history which feels really strangely contemporary. Always getting, he doesn't just want one version of events. He's always trying to cross-reference. And he's very interested in what are the actual motivations below the surface motivations that are presented. So I think a big part of it is looking at the fall of Athens, because Athens had this incredible cultural impact and political, in terms of democracy impact, but also the specific why we're so fascinated with that war is, in addition to the fact that it basically resulted in the end of Athens as a dominant kind of military political power, also just that we have this masterpiece, incredibly detailed look at it from various different perspectives.
Yeah, well, Thucydides is enormously influential as a father, really, of, as you suggest, realist international relations. It's a grisly book, a gruesome book, full of terrible violence, equivalent kind of violence to what's happening today in Ukraine and Gaza. With 2,500 years of hindsight, Ferdia, was Thucydides honest? Or is there some inventions? Was there an agenda, as there tends to be for all historians, to his history of the Peloponnesian War?
Yeah, a very good point to raise. And again, ultimately, only Thucydides could know for sure what his agenda might or might not have been. We can kind of guess and do a little bit of detective work. He was, he was a very wealthy Athenian citizen. He was a general. He was disgraced he had a kind of military command that didn't go very well, and then he was exiled, which gave him this unique position of being able to travel around areas that he wouldn't otherwise have been able to go to as an Athenian. So some people have hypothesized that he's one of the people responsible for his exile was this Athenian statesman called Cleon, and he's extremely critical of Cleon. So you can potentially, potentially see a bias that might have been there in the way that some of his political opponents were represented. So I think what you might expect by something written by an Athenian is that it's going to be quite jingoistic. It's going to be very patriotic about Athens, and I would say that's not really the case at all. He can be very, there's a sympathetic portrayal of various different Spartan political figures of like the description of the Syracusan or the Sicilian expedition is especially fascinating, given how brutal the outcome was for the Athenians. And yet there's a really nuanced, quite even keel depiction of the Syracusan side as well. So, I'm sure he did have his agenda, but I think what's more surprising is how relatively nothing is ever truly objective. There's always a point of view. There's always some level of intention behind it. But I think he's surprisingly objective, or seems to be anyway.
There's a moral, and I haven't read Thucydides for years, but from what I remember, there's a moral seriousness to his history of the Peloponnesian War, a seriousness about the unaccountable violence, especially the violence against people not involved in the war. Is Thucydides ultimately, for all his realism, was he a moralist?
Yeah, I don't know. I think he definitely. There are certainly a few indications. For example, there's where he describes the violence against civilians, where he clearly kind of steps out of his objective descriptive role and clearly shows that he finds it morally reprehensible, or that he finds it shocking. So there is, I think, it's very restrained, and it doesn't usually alter, or it's not consistently present throughout the narrative, but it definitely comes out. Yeah.
Do you think if Putin or Netanyahu were to pick up Thucydides, maybe they already have, do you think it would be a warning against the way they're behaving in Ukraine or Gaza?
I think it should be, but one of the interesting things about human beings is they can very often find within a text justification for what they're doing. And I think a text as rich as Thucydides, there certainly are, warnings about, unrestrained imperialism or brutality in that book. I would hope that they would take it in that way, but you never know.
Well, you never know. You're an expert, Ferdia, not really on the history, but on the human aspects, and that's what your book, your new book, your first novel, Glorious Exploits, is all about. I'll take a short break and then we'll talk specifically about the book. I want to remind everyone that great guests like Ferdia Lennon are brought to us by our friends at Liberties, an excellent new quarterly journal of culture and politics. Going to run a short feature on Liberties, and then we'll be back with Ferdia Lennon to talk specifically about his excellent new novel, Glorious Exploits. Don't go away, anyone. We'll be back in a second.
The noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
And you can subscribe to Liberties at libertiesjournal.com. We're speaking with Ferdia Lennon, the Irish-based novelist, first-time author of Glorious Exploits. It came out earlier in the year in the UK. It's just out in the US. Ferdia, the first half of this book, of this show, was rather gruesome. We talked about murder and mayhem in the Eastern Mediterranean. But your book, Glorious Exploits, is in many ways a comedy. What was funny about that period? Where'd you find the humor?
Yeah, where did I find the humor? I think I'm saying, like, for me, I think very often life it's neither one thing, you know, it's both comedic and absurd and joyful, exuberant, moving. And then at other times it can just kind of be utterly brutal and tragic. And I think I've always been interested in the tragicomic mode, in that, you know, that blending of the two. And also I love along with the tragedies, Sophocles, Euripides, etc. I love the comedies of Aristophanes. And he's kind of the only playwright who's talking about the contemporary moment. So if you read Aristophanes' plays, they're very often set in contemporary Athens, and they're not just about the wealthy elites or the gods, etc. And they're very, very funny. And I think that comedy stands up today. So I see, in a way, Glorious Exploits. He's narrated by this guy Lampo, down on his luck, unemployed potter, almost as a tragedy narrated by someone who sees it as a comedy until he doesn't, if that makes sense. You know, if this book was narrated by Gelon, it would be almost an out-and-out tragedy.
Remind us who Gelon is.
So Gelon it's about two best friends, Lampo, both of them, Lampo and Gelon, unemployed potters. Gelon is a kind of theater-obsessed Syracusan, and Lampo is a more just along for the ride. And it begins, first. So Gelon says to me, "Let's go down and feed the Athenians. The weather's perfect for feeding Athenians." And we're in the midst of this situation where these Athenian prisoners have been kept and left to die in these limestone quarries, which really happened. They arrive with these ambitions of conquering the islands, defeating Syracuse, and a year or so later, they're basically completely powerless, wasting away. But we know from Plutarch's life of Nicias that some of these prisoners actually survived. Some of these defeated Athenians survived by quoting lines from Euripides' plays, because their captors were completely obsessed with Athenian drama, especially the work of Euripides. So that kind of juxtaposition of cruelty and fascination with art was like really the springboard for this novel that I wanted to kind of tease out a little bit.
You, as I mentioned at the beginning, you live in Ireland. You're based in Ireland, and a lot of the excellent reviews of the book have suggested that you bring an Irish wit and irreverence to antiquity. There's also a kind of Schweckian quality, I think, to the heroes of your book. Perhaps the Irish and certainly the Czechs bring this humor as a resistance to power. Is the humor in the book, in a way, the best way to fight power, military power, brutality, cruelty?
Yeah, I think it's a way, you know, I think Irish people, you know, Ireland was obviously colonized, and maybe perhaps there is that element of Irish humor that was somewhat developed in the face of oppression, or in the face of, you know, they weren't militarily capable necessarily of
And
resisting.
like the Athenians, they were brutalized by supposedly, the Irish also brutalized by supposedly civilized nation, the English.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think one of the things that humor can do is it can allow you to criticize someone or criticize a thing in an oblique way, in an indirect way. And also, if you can make somebody laugh, there's almost in a sense where you can slightly sugarcoat the criticism, and within their shared laughter, there's a sense of persuasion, or the release of toleration of the point of view. So I think I don't know if it's the best or the only, but it is a way. It certainly is a way. Yeah, and the reason for the Irish voice, you know, a lot of people, you know, well, why are they Irish? And, you know, part of it is I'm from Dublin. It was a very natural way of telling the story. But in addition to that, you have this sense of Sicily is, you know, it was, you know, Greek speaking, colonized, but it was colonized by mainland Greece. So you have this island that's been colonized by mainland Greek city states. And I thought Ireland also was an island that had been colonized by an external state, and using Hyberlo English as a metaphor in a way to give a sense of how Syracuse might stand in relation to the rest of the Greek world would jolt a reader, would be unique, but also actually have its own logic in a way that this, you know, the convention that we have, like, okay, this is ancient Greece and Rome, and everyone's just going to sound like they've stepped off the cricket pitch at Eton. You know what I mean? And if you do that, if you have characters sound like they're from Brideshead Revisited, we almost go, oh yeah, that makes sense. But it doesn't really, you know, make any sense, or certainly no more sense. I would argue probably less sense than what I tried to do here.
Yeah, the gentlemen in Brideshead Revisited were, of course, also brutal colonialists. Were the Athenians or the Carthaginians, were they the same essentially? Did they, behind all the civilization, all the highfalutin talk of democracy and rights and culture and art, was they just violent?
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky, isn't it? It's never necessarily just one thing, or perhaps it is. I mean, that was Orwell's perspective on the British Empire and the British colonial.
And of course, for him, particularly his writing in Burma, where he saw through it.
Exactly, you know, and he was a police officer, so he saw firsthand. He was deeply kind of cynical about whatever was presented as the aims. Where the Athenians, I mean, if you believe Thucydides, there's a really interesting dialogue called the Melian dialogue in the history of the Peloponnesian War, where essentially you probably are familiar with it. It's very famous because essentially within it, Athens lays out the reason for its reason for its invasion of this small island of Melos, and what gets stripped away is any pretense that, you know, this is a cultural, political, this is, you know, any pretense of morality is stripped away, and it's literally just, well, to be honest, if your neutrality is a hindrance to us, and you getting absorbed in our empire is good for us, so let's not talk about the gods, etc. You know, the weak suffer what they must, and the strong do what they will. So, yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting exchange, because I think in general, people all often, and communities and groups want to feel that what they're doing is moral. And what's quite unique about that exchange is that all pretense is actually, it's acknowledged as a pretense and discarded. So yeah.
Ferdia, it's interesting you brought up Orwell. Last year we had Anna Funder on the show. I'm sure you're familiar with her new book, Wifedom, which is a feminist critique of Orwell, and a book about his wife. So far, we've only talked about the men. The two central figures in the book are both male. What about the women? Are there many women in the book, or is it all men?
Yeah, there are definitely important, female characters, women in the novel. It is predominantly, the main characters in the book, because the main characters are these two friends, Gelon and Lampo, and then also the Athenian prisoners who were all male soldiers. But there are some crucial. One of the the benefactors, and the main costume designer and theatrical, producer of all things theatrical in Syracuse, is this Syracusan woman called Alecto, who is very key to their production of Medea and Trojan women. And also Lampo falls in love with a local slave girl in his local bar, Lyra. So these are key characters in the novel.
Very Irish. The two men are described as mates. Some people might have written this book and turned them into lovers. What about the homosexual element in Syracuse in particular? Your reading of that. Were you ever tempted to add a homosexual dimension to this narrative?
Yeah, I think in an earlier version, so one of the prisoners, one of the main kind of Athenian prisoners is this guy called Paches. And in the very first chapter of the novel, his lover is murdered. And that kind of continues as a kind of subtle thread, his grief throughout the novel. That was initially going to be a much larger section of the book, where I had written parts from the Athenian perspective. So it was going to go back and go into the Athenian invasion of Sicily. So you would get that dual point of view. But when I was working on it, and that would have gone in a little bit to that, the relationship between Paches and his lover Philo would have dealt more with that aspect of ancient Greek, which was, very common, in ancient Greece, definitely. Was
so
a lot more.
Rather than a Celtic caper, it could have been a Celtic romantic caper. What about the gods? Where are they, Ferdia, in this book? When you visit, I mentioned at the beginning, I just come back from southwestern Sicily. The gods are everywhere in the remains. They dwarf man. Do the gods appear, and are they serious, or are they part of the comedy?
They do appear in the book. They're kind of taken as a pagan society. So the gods are all around you, and often where you least expect it.
Enormous. I mean, at Agrigento, there's this recreation of the vision of the gods, and physically they're so imposing. They're terrifying, even when we look at them now.
Yeah, no, definitely. It was fundamental to the Greek, worldview was the idea of the gods and the idea of appeasing the gods, of sacrifice, of trying to, the belief, that runs through the Iliad. The gods are always watching you, and the concept that if you can sacrifice to them or do something for them, or do something in such a way that you gain their favor. So I think that runs through the novel. In a, they're not running around the place going to temples constantly, but there definitely is that question. Because also what is for me quite interesting, I would hazard a guess that Thucydides was probably an atheist. So there's never really any divine explanation of phenomena within Thucydides' book. So you had a real intense belief amongst most of the population in the gods as an explanation for events, but you also had people who were deeply skeptical, agnostic, or probably atheists in Greek society at this time. So that runs, that question of it are these awful events that are, happening, these wars, these endless cycles of violence and upheaval, are they part of some divine plan, or are they just happening? And that is something that our characters, Lampo and Gelon, are trying to understand in a way.
Yeah, I wonder, I don't want to get into this, but just a thought that one of the reasons perhaps Thucydides didn't believe in the gods is because he'd seen war. In that way, is rather like Machiavelli, another ex-general who was exiled to his desk to write influential histories. It's a fascinating story, and it's a wonderful story. Ferdia. So many people want to write novels and they don't get around to it, or they're not successful. Your book, as I said, Your first novel is already out. It's out in the US this week, and it was out earlier in the year in the UK. It has several foreign editions. You are a writer. Any suggestions for aspiring novelists from your experience? A few days ago, we did a show with my old friend Keith Tier from That Was the Week, suggesting that the online quote-unquote creative economy is fine for the platforms, but it's terrible for writers and other creatives. Everyone these days seems to be struggling to make a living, even high-profile writers. What did you do right? What have you done right? And what advice would you give people who have a project like Glorious Exploits and want to make it a success, want to get it into people's hands?
Yeah. Well, thanks very much. What I did right was probably, I worked very, one level is I just wrote the book, and I was writing for years. This book took a long time to.
You were at writing school in East Anglia. Was that a hindrance or a help ultimately?
In retrospect, now with hindsight, I think it was definitely a help. And what was great about it was that everybody takes it very seriously. So there's a level of intensity that I think a good program like that people bring to it, and intention that people bring to it. Also, I just made some really good friends, writer friends. And through the long periods of writing and hoping that you will finish the book and that you will get it published, we helped each other out and we provided advice and we shared our work. So I think that sense of writing is very often very isolating. So that sense of community was great, and the program had some great writers who would visit, and also it was useful. I think agents, etc., are interested in that program because of its history. So that aspect of it was practically useful. But my advice is the main thing is just, it sounds easy. Write what you're fascinated by. I wasn't, when I sat down to write Glorious Exploits, I wasn't kind of, I wrote a story that I actually thought was, I didn't necessarily think that everyone was going to be, it wasn't the obvious route, a story about unemployed potters getting prisoners of war to put on a Greek tragedy. But I just believed in that idea. And I was fascinated by that period of history. So my advice would be to write about what you are excited about, what you're passionate about. People often talk about, write what you know. And what springs to mind is like Tolkien. Like, imagine if Tolkien just wrote what he knew in a very autobiographical sense. It would just be like, I'm an Oxford Don.
Yeah, although he kind of did. I mean, it's hard to write about something you don't know.
There's different types of knowing. So of course, at a certain level, you always have to bring your experience, your lived experience, to anything that you do to make it come alive. I just mean in a that idea of a very straight line interpretation of what you know. I think write what you're excited by, and you can imbue with a kind of a bit of vitality.
How long did it take from beginning to end, from starting to publishing?
It took about 7 years. And
Homeric.
Yeah, it was Homeric. Yeah, definitely. It felt it sometimes pretty Homeric.
So you're Odysseus.
Well, I wasn't going to say it, but
Yeah, I couldn't. That was a softball for me. And finally, Ferdia, what's next? I hear you're writing not about antiquity, but a book, perhaps a novel about 14th century France. Are those rumors correct?
Yeah. So book 2 is set in France in the 1400s. I lived in Paris for many years, and I'm always been very interested in French culture and history, and that period, kind of mid 1300s France, where you've got the 100 Years' War, you've got the plague. People are dealing with the fact that nearly half the population's disappeared. You have peasant revolts, so you have a real questioning of the way in which society should be organized. Yeah, that's in my instance, my novel will be delving into some of that.
Is that going to take another 7 years?
I think I'll get maybe 6.5.